Welcome to Beyond the Box, the podcast where we unpack the future of global logistics. I'm Philip Lewin, and I'm joined today by my co host, Nicole Allen.
Thanks, Phil. In today's episode, we're exploring how companies are navigating a world of shifting trade routes, evolving sanctions, and emerging markets. With traditional shipping lanes under pressure, businesses are being forced to rethink how and where they move goods.
Yes, and we're very excited to be joined by two experts today who both bring deep insights into the operational and regulatory sides of this challenge. So, first, I'd like to welcome Margaret Kidd. She is a lecturer of supply chain and logistics and technology at the University of Houston, and she's also the president of the Houston Maritime Center and Museum. Welcome, Margaret.
Well, thank you for hosting me and welcome to the great state of Texas.
Yes, we're very glad to have you joining us from Houston today. And we're also pleased to welcome our guest who's dialing in from Munich, Erika Trujillo, who is the co-founder and managing director of SEIA Compliance Technologies. Erika advises companies on sanctions, export controls, and customs compliance. It's so great to have you here, Erika.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
And let's dive right in. And Margaret, ever since we've emerged from the pandemic, it's been kind of nonstop disruptions in global trade, everything from port congestion, geopolitical tensions, armed conflicts, and a lot of the tariff activities. And a lot of these are putting pressure on kind of traditional shipping routes and causing companies to rethink their routes and their shipping strategies. Do you think we're seeing in a way like a rewiring of long-established global trade routes, or is this just more kind of temporary adjustments while companies wait for things to stabilize a little bit in global supply chains?
Well, I think we have a number of things occurring at the same time. I mean, there is this real global realignment happening. And on the short term basis, certainly there's some pivoting because of conflict or natural disasters. But one of the lessons we learned during COVID is you had to be agile, right? You had to have plan B, C, and D. And it's really put a lot of pressure on manufacturing and those in procurement to rethink their strategies, not have all their eggs invested in that one proverbial basket called China. This is going to take years to kind of recalibrate this and move manufacturing a little closer to where consumers are. Um, here in the United States, our largest trading partners are Mexico and Canada. So there's certainly possibilities for nearshoring and onshoring manufacturing here in our hemisphere. But these are long-term CapEx ideas and take years to implement.
And Erika, let's zoom out a bit. Beyond the headline disruptions, what are some of the less visible ripple effects, perhaps changes in supplier behavior, insurance costs, or even regulatory scrutiny that are really forcing companies to rethink their supply chain strategies?
Oh, I think definitely that's a big question of the day. And I would say the ripple effect is fundamentally changing how we think about our industry and our role within our organizations. Not only do I think that many of these changes are pushing us to be more strategic partners for our business and think about how we can leverage actually our insights from the logistics fields or from the trade compliance fields to support our organizations in building much stronger business resilience. But as a result of that, I think it's also changing the way that we actually do our jobs in these industries. And I think on the other side of this, we're also seeing a much greater need for transparency. We've been hearing a lot about gaining supply chain transparency, right? About who's in your supply chain. But I think transparency actually goes much farther than that. It's about, do you really understand what's going on in your business? Do you understand if your processes are working effectively? Do you have transparency to fundamentally change the way you do business tomorrow if the regulations change? And then transparency over, what's happening after you turn your products over to some of your business partners, be that logistics providers, brokers, customers, distributors, etc. So I think the ripple effect, as just to sum up, is about twofold here, fundamentally changing how our industry is positioned, but really also affecting the day-to-day business in terms of how we're doing that job.
And I would just add that we have to build this resiliency into our day to day operations and train our workers to have those creative ideas, plan A, B, C, and D, and to refine those plans because the new normal is there is no normal.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. And I think we've seen that in what I like to say is our old programs were about coming to legal minimums. And now we really have to take a policy based approach, I think, to logistics and to trade compliance topics. Because as you said, there's no normal. The regulations are changing, some cases quite literally every Thursday. So if we are building systems based on those regulatory changes, we're always going to be playing catch up. So I think you're right, Margaret. We need to find that kind of synergy between our people, between our business, and especially between our data to say, how do we really take a risk based approach? And also, how can we optimize these systems so that we have that business resilience if something changes tomorrow?
I know with all these global trade lane changes, there's also a lot of exciting opportunities, especially in emerging markets. What are some of the factors that companies should keep in mind if they're looking to expand into Middle East, Africa, Latin America, some of the upcoming markets?
I think you're highlighting a much bigger trend here is there is no new normal, right? And I think everybody is scrambling to kind of find new trade lanes, understand what they can do, what they can't do. Emerging markets, especially, provide, as you said, in many cases, new financial opportunities. But they do, of course, also come with some things that we just want to keep an eye on as we're expanding into those markets. And I definitely want to highlight the fact that new sometimes is inherently risky just because it's uncharted territory. So if you're working with new business partners, again, be that on the logistics side or the customer side, that's going to require that additional step of due diligence because you don't really know what daily business looks like yet. You don't know what's unusual because you don't have a usual yet. And maybe I can give one practical example that we've seen that often gets overlooked is from, the company perspective, you're often thinking, okay, I'm sending my products from A to Z, but you're not necessarily thinking about all of the places you have to go through or all the steps you have to go through to get from A to Z, especially with ground transport. That's something that's quite interesting. I was just talking to someone the other day. They have a tracker that they put on their shipping containers for specific products. And that tracker itself is actually a controlled item in the EU. So they got into a little bit of hot water recently because they changed their shipping routes, going, we'll say, down south. And in that process, they had to drive through various countries where they actually would have required an export license, not for the product in the box, but for the little tracker attached to the box. So do approach these emerging markets with a significantly higher level of care for trade compliance topics like export control, sanctions, and customs, and do think outside the box in terms of what those implications might be.
Without a doubt, Erica, I mean, a critical department is your trade compliance. And if you're a smaller organization, to be partnered with a professional that can really keep you out of that hot water. Um, the emerging markets do get tricky, and I totally concur with you that there's extra care that you should have when you're approaching them. But when I look at emerging markets from an infrastructure standpoint, I see these incredible opportunities when we look at, say, for instance, India and the infrastructure that's being invested, and it's a multiplier effect. And, it creates more opportunity for manufacturing, sourcing, et cetera.
Margaret, I think you bring up such a good point, and I think this is a trend that we're only going to see more of. As you said, it's exponentially growing. I think when we were, of course, all very heavily discussing kind of what the situation with US and China is, as a result of, I think, a lot of those, we'll say, political circumstances, we have seen other markets come up. We've seen whole new trade lanes come up. We've seen a lot of development in countries that maybe didn't have as much attention in the past. And I think that's a really interesting development that we don't just have these kind of primary trading blocks anymore. We are seeing a lot more attention being given to some of these other, not only markets, but as you said, places with great infrastructure. And I think we are seeing a shift in terms of where people are also investing their money when they start looking into logistics. Of course, in the Middle East, the kind of Dubai region's been a hot topic for many for a long time, because they are looking for these kind of neutral middle grounds where doing logistics and trade is going to be supported.
Yeah, I would say the Emirates and Saudi are really very central players in this Asia to Europe trade lanes, and definitely kind of replacing the world order of some sort. I've been very impressed with the government of India, their national infrastructure pipeline, and just the investment not only into infrastructure, but digitization of the economy to keep trade flowing.
Maybe to put a finer point on it, what should companies be doing up front to avoid surprises when moving into some of these newer markets?
You should always have a local partner. I mean, whether that's a consulting firm, a law firm, or even a competitor that you have a joint venture. Think Sun Tzu and the Art of War. I mean, you just don't go do business in a place you don't know the rules. And sometimes you need that local partner. And many times there's local content laws that require you to have a partner.
No, I think the local partnership is incredibly important also to really point out which rules and regulations are going to be most important when you're entering those markets, both from a functional and legal point of view. And I think also before you're even starting to go into kind of those new trade lanes, I think you really need to understand also what your business is, because you don't want to end up exploring new trade lanes only to find out actually you shouldn't be doing business there because of whatever sanctions implications. So, for example, if you are a subsidiary of a US company, or if you have US origin products, that may greatly restrict what markets you're actually able to do business in or even transport through. So I think before we even get to that point, I would strongly recommend companies to really understand at a deep material level what business they're actually doing, what is their exposure to some of these extraterritorial legal systems like the United States, and really have a clear understanding for their business what those options are before they start entering the market.
That's great. And Margaret, I actually wanted to circle back to your comments earlier on India. If you look at these emerging markets, companies look at local labor pools, manufacturing footprints. What makes a market attractive from a logistics and infrastructure standpoint for expansion?
Well, I mean, I think there's a variety of factors. I mean, one is, what kind of incentives does a company have? I mean, India had a huge increase in foreign direct investment over the last 10 years. You've got to look at the workforce, the educational attainment. So I think that we've got to rethink where we're doing our manufacturing and really need to look at some of these middle income countries as a substitute for over concentration in China.
And some of them have really a lot of investment going into this space. I know in Abu Dhabi, the customs authorities are heavily investing in digitalization. I know you've just mentioned also the heavy investment in digitalization in India. And I think it will be very interesting. And Margaret, I think I'd love to hear your opinion on this. In a few years, instead of some of these countries looking to some of the Western governments to see how they're doing customs and how they're processing logistics, it may be interesting to see some of these best practices actually coming from countries like India or the Middle East, who are maybe a little bit farther ahead in a few years in terms of digitalization for these import export processes. What do you think about this?
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, I am just amazed at the digitization that we're seeing in Southeast Asia, in India, even looking at specific sectors like construction, vis-a-vis the US or even Europe. So there are best practices don't just come from the West, they come from the rest. So we need to take this global lens when we look at, how do we do this?
And when When disruptions and hurdles appear, I'm curious about how logistic professionals are recalibrating on the ground. Do either of you have an example, perhaps, that you could provide of what that looks like in practice?
I think, there's a couple of things. And I mean, it really kind of comes down to diversifying your sourcing, looking at your routing decisions ahead of time before a problem happens, having contingency plans in place. Forget just in time, it's just in case. You've got to have inventories. I think there's definitely a little move to more regionalization of trade if possible, if there is a sourcing alternative. And I think, again, training your people. There's got to be communication and a lot of development of people within these operations.
Maybe just to add from more the kind of regulatory side of this, we've seen a number of these examples, of course, over the last few years. One was, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, immediately causing a lot of organizations to have to suddenly understand, okay, what does this mean in terms of our organization? Currently, of course, one of the big topics was tariffs. That's forcing a lot of organizations to think about where are we, producing our products, where is our country of origin, where's our assembly, et cetera. And the way that we usually see this with at least the companies that we work with is really that kind of immediate need to say, okay, what do we need to know at first? So let's just take an example with HS codes that are now subject to Russia sanctions. A lot of organizations were not really set up to deal with that because the traditional process of license determination for export controls or sanctions processes was, of course, always focused on export controls classification. HS codes, like that was a customs thing. And suddenly now all these organizations are like, well, do we have high priority items in our material list? How do we find that? So that was something where, immediately the companies we work with needed to be able to see, okay, here's all your products based on HS codes subject to these, high priority items. They are subject to Russia sanctions. Then the next step is immediately, okay, well, where are we doing business with those products? Do we have direct business with Russia? They needed to see that trade flow overview immediately. Where are they buying directly or indirectly from Russia? Where are they sending to Russia? Where do they have Russian business partners? So maybe they're shipping to China, but actually the business partner is Russian. Suddenly you need to know that for diversion and circumvention reasons. And then kind of like the final step that we saw in this process was to say, okay, now we need to do monitoring. We need to really be making sure that, you know, how come we've always had a certain HS code for a certain product? It magically changes to something else. Now it's not subject to sanctions and it's going to Kazakhstan, right? Or how come suddenly we have a business partner in Paraguay that's ordering a ton of components and they've never ordered an installed base of our product, right? So I think that's like the three steps that we recommend and we see a lot of companies doing is first leverage the data to get as much transparency over what that new change means for your business. Map out your business partners, products, and trade flows for that impact. And then do continuous internal monitoring for that risk exposure so that you can really pinpoint any kind of, let's say, gaps that you need to fill to make sure that you're compliant or at least informing the business intelligently about what this means for the organization.
Yeah.
That's great. And let's just wrap things up. If you have like one takeaway for our audience, I know we've unpacked a lot today, but maybe Erica, let's start with you. What would be your one key takeaway for people?
Really understand your data. And I know that I've said this a few times already, but just to hammer it home, I think we really often overlook actually just how much we know within our organization, how much information is there for us. And I'm always asking, how can I become aware of what my company knows? Because that's obviously going to have numerous legal implications, but it's also going to help me be a good business partner to my organization, whether I'm in logistics or in industry. And then I think, as Margaret said, being able to integrate kind of the insights you get from data into these real world people processes being able to do that jump is really already going to get us so far ahead and help us better manage these risks as we're all trying to figure out what the unusual new normal actually is.
That's great. And Margaret, please, your key takeaway.
Yeah, and I'm gonna leverage what Erica just shared about the data. When you have this big data, you have to have technology. And I think about a study that was 3 decades long that Oxford Economics and Huawei did and looked at, what technology brought to the table. A dollar investment brought 6.7. So we've got to pivot and move towards AI to help us optimize our supply chains, to help us with decision making, to help run scenario planning. We've got to embrace digital twins of our operations. So, my takeaway is there's big investments to be made in technology and our people to use that technology.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode, and I can't thank you both enough for the time that you took today. So, Margaret and Erica, thank you again for joining us.
And thanks to all our listeners for joining us. And you can always find us where you listen to podcasts, Beyond the Boxes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.
And we'll continue exploring how global supply chains are adapting in real time in our next episode, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.